That's right. Okay, so we are, okay, just very briefly, I'm not going to, because I think the discussion has done this already. This is sort of just pointing out the uneven solidarity that, you know, exactly the things that people have said. It's a privilege, and even access to education is a privilege. So striking is a high profile activism, blah, blah. Okay, so but I think those points have been made already. And then this intergenerational thing, that some adults picking up the narrative in very interesting ways, I think, that are actually themselves, one might think of as patronizing as well, even as saying the right sort of thing. So this is Save the Children, that the children have the biggest stake in what the future looks like. We're in a time of great hardship. Let's work so that the COVID generation becomes synonymous not with disease and despair, but with a time where we came together and gave the gift, one generation to another, of a world in which all children everywhere can live the life of their choosing. Okay, so I think that you can see that this is in its way rather patronizing as well, and yet it's an adult reacting to the Thunberg things. And having said all that, of course, the environmental issue is really crucially important. But as if you remember here, talking about environmental justice, there are many children around the world who've been raising resistance to environmental issues. Okay. So I want to move on to thinking about personal transformation as well, and how important it is. And a paper that Ruth Ellen Josselson, well, she's published many papers on this, shows really how personal transformation too is linked with time, with temporality and social change. And I think that Molly sent you round a paper from Ruth Ellen Josselson as well. But one of the things that I was struck by that she's done is interviewing 19 American women for 46 years. So over the course of 46 years, she's re-interviewed them. And these are white American women. And she points out how the stories that they tell change in relation to what's happening in their lives and to how society itself has changed. And an example that always sticks in my mind is Maria, who comes from an Italian-American family. And in her teens, she had a relationship with an African-American young man, in her 20s. That obviously at the time that she did was very derided, and her family didn't like it and so on. And you can just imagine if the US is still racially divided, it was much more so. And she tells it differently over time. So that first of all, she's telling it as something where she is morally upright as compared with her family. Then when she has a daughter herself who becomes teenage and with whom she's having difficulty, she portrays it as a period of teenage rebellion. And then later on, she comes, I'll skip out some, but she comes round to romanticizing it as really sort of a good period in her life when she both was morally upright and where there was a lot of fun as well. So the point being that it's relational to what's happening in her life, it's relational to what's happening in the society, so that different stories have to be seen as a product of a different time. Some stories are made possible with social change, and different stories are told to different people, with some stories only being told in research because people don't have the same access to telling the stories. Okay, and Dan McAdams, also a US narrative scholar, but from a psychological perspective, from a personality psychology perspective, who's done also a lot of work, talks about how people create meaning and purpose in their life through their personal stories. And that in the US, in midlife, many people tell stories that he calls redemptive stories. They're stories of redemption, where people have transformed pain and suffering into a life that is much more acceptable, worthwhile, and so on. And as he says, these are the stories we live by, that we walk around with these stories inside us, frequently drawing upon them to explain ourselves to others, to guide our behavior, shape our experience, and to inform the decisions we make about our lives. So the stories that we live by are also moral stories. And often the redemptive narratives are about second chances in life. Okay. And then those personal stories being social. Now, Jill, who's going to talk tomorrow, Jill Bradbury, talks about the way in which there's an inextricable linking of the psychological and the social. Molly also does this, but to quote Jill, an individual life history is entwined with the wider historical processes of our collective life, and the narrative self is never disconnected from the narratives of others, past, present, and future. We tell the story of our lives to others and can only tell these stories in the words or languages or language of others. So we cannot divorce our stories from history, from being situated in history, but also emplaced. That always it's psychosocial, that the stories that we tell are stories that we see, and certain stories are only possible both to see and to tell at particular times. So we have to think about relationality and individual subjectivity being socially produced. Is this okay, or am I going, because I'm wanting to get through a fair bit. Is this okay in terms of speed? Okay, fantastic. And as Jill does in her book, and many other people do, I'm absolutely fascinated with the way in which the past haunts the present and indeed the future. So I've taken to using the notion of hauntology. And there are obviously contradictory ways in which narratives of the past are used. So they're sedimented into this notion of the past is another country, they do things differently there, and the past is never dead, it's not even past. And Obama here, talking about enslavement, obviously, the past isn't dead and buried, in fact, it isn't even past. We do not need to recite here the history of racial injustice in this country, but we do need to remind ourselves that so many of the disparities that exist in the African American community today can be directly traced to inequalities passed on from an earlier generation that suffered under the brutal legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. So understanding legacy requires memory, and narrative is important because the memories that people call on, how they remember them, are contradictory and only produced through particular understandings of the past, particular access to the past, and so on. And Toni Morrison, who's a US author, now dead, but in a book of essays that she wrote, which is very powerful, called Playing in the Dark, talks about how slavery is the shadow at the heart of the American dream. And she writes very interesting things about that. So a narrative about how the histories of enslavement, unspoken about, is always present. And she talks about how, for example, excluding Black people from stories, and it is itself a legacy of that. You know, the effort that it takes to exclude is informed by that history of enslavement and so on. And Paul Gilroy, a British cultural studies scholar, talks about post-colonial melancholia and the way that the denial of the impact of slavery and the losses that would be entailed by acknowledging them produces a melancholia in society that's not acknowledged. Jane Flax, a white psychoanalyst and feminist scholar, talks about the ways in which that this lack of acknowledgement of enslavement leads to sometimes paralyzing wishes to magically erase the living past rather than engage in the arduous processes of realistically facing its effects. And she says that proper acknowledgement of enslavement would mean that one has to lose some narratives in the US and in the UK, and indeed many other places, including Nordic countries too. One, that American history and practices are exceptional and exemplary. Two, that dominance and privilege has been achieved only through individual merit and effort. And three, that it's not acceptable or possible to redistribute social and economic goods to Black people, for example. Okay, so the point being that one of the things that it's important to bear in mind, and why intersectionality is important, is that the multiple positioning that we all have also includes history. So that we need to think about how history has inflected lives differently. And there are many ways in which narrative scholars might get at this, and thinking about the interlinking of the national and the personal in narratives. So Michael Billig, who is actually a discourse analyst, a rhetorical analyst, talks about the ways in which thinking about apartheid ending in South Africa, and how at that point the white population had to learn to control their talk. And what it did was controlling the talk made certain things unsayable and then unthinkable. So it leads to a shift in identities, which doesn't mean those things are not there, but actually they're denied very much because the context has shifted and changed. And Jill Bradbury, who I've mentioned before, who will talk tomorrow and has just gone, talks about how a lot of white South Africans now say that they didn't know what was happening during apartheid. So, and indeed, one of the things that other scholars have pointed out is that you'd think that there was nobody who was in favor of apartheid in the past either. So that not only did they not know, but they were not in favor of it. And now that there is quite a groundswell of white South Africans who say that things were not as bad under apartheid as it is now for white young people in South Africa. So that's one of the narratives that shifted. And so narratives are always in contestation because Black South Africans would not have that narrative at all. So changes in narratives are parts of shifts in identities. They're also about claims to the future, and that's really important. And as I said before, one of the things I really like about narrative theory is that it links the past, the present, and the future. And as Stuart Hall pointed out, identities are as much about becoming as being. So narrative claims in the present are also claims on the future and ways of acting to bring futures into being. So one of the things that Eleanor Oakes, who's a US linguistic anthropologist, points out is that conversational stories are stories that step into the future. They anticipate the future, they open up possibilities, and they help us to avoid potential pitfalls, things that might or might not happen, but also, as scholars of narrative, of political narratives point out, the stories we tell can also mobilize future action. Okay, time is motoring. I'm going to skip some of this, so I'll skip that. And also Francesca Paletta, who's a narrative scholar, a political scholar, making the point that our stories can be more powerful than political deliberations and statistics and so on. So, but I'm also not going to read that out, to move on a bit. Okay, I'll skip that. So transforming stories, shifting stories can lead to historical turning points and also can produce personal hope. So this is Afia Amesu, who's British Black young woman who was a student at UCL. And she says, the protests in the UK have undoubtedly marked a historical turning point in how the nation views issues of race. And she has hope. I still have hope. Why? Why should a young Black woman hold on to hope in the face of normalized and ingrained racism and discrimination? Well, what's become clearer to me through the revitalization of the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK and across the world is the growing awareness of issues faced by Black communities everywhere, and awareness by those who sit at every level of society. And she says she's witnessed that it's a call to action and a time for change, and that matters. So certain things that were not hearable by many people in the past are now hearable, and indeed are now more sayable because of the historical turning point of George Floyd's murder and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And in any country in which you are, there'll be things that are those sorts of markers that lead to historical turning points and make certain things hearable and sayable. And this is a very different example that I was going to have you also analyze, but there is no time for that. But showing really that socio-structural positioning is also in the personal, so that something that seems hugely personal also has within it policies, also the way in which social work operates, the way in which the state thinks children ought to be cared for, as well as who gets to be cared for as refugees and so on. So huge state policies, global movements, global policies, as well as the very personal. So here, a Caribbean, Black Caribbean foster carer of an Afghan boy refugee, not from this latest period of Afghan migration, but earlier. And she says that the social worker in the interview here done by Coley and colleagues says at the beginning he was very, very quiet. And I knew that was because he didn't know who to trust and who not to trust. Then one morning I was cooking paratha and he quickly came out of the bathroom, came quickly downstairs and said, the smell. My mum used to cook paratha and the smell used to come just like that. And I said, would you like some? And he said, oh yes. Stood there watching me make the paratha and said, that reminds me of my mum. And I could see tears coming in his eyes as he watched me. So I gave him tea and a paratha and said, tell me about it. Tell me what your mum used to do. And then he began to talk about his mum, about home, and later about his journey. And he began to trust me. Then he could talk about all the bad things, the things that had happened on his journey here and that had been kept locked inside. And the point about that, yesterday, Molly said, people are now beginning to think about objects and so on as ways to think about narratives. Well, here you have food very much, and many people use food for narratives, for temporality and so on, but also emotionality and histories sedimented into things like paratha. And indeed, parathas are also part of Caribbean cooking. Why? Because of the histories of post-enslavement movement of Asian populations to the Caribbean to do the work that the ex-slave population refused to do, and so on. So all these things are built in together. I'm going to have to, I want to leave the last few minutes to you to just make comments, to say, anything that comes to mind. So perhaps I'll just say a little word about this, because one of the things that happened last year was that there was on BBC television in Britain a documentary that looked at the way in which in the British school system, Black people, my generation, and something that I escaped, but which many young people around me, Black young people, did not, were routinely classed and tested, and psychologists said that they were educationally subnormal, and they were put in schools for the educationally subnormal. And this was even though the Education Authority knew that most were not educationally subnormal. And the people in the picture up there, the one on the extreme right, was the first Black educational psychologist, Waveney Bushell. The other three are people who talked about the way in which that history of shame was something they never talked about, but actually that made them have to prove themselves again and again. The woman in the middle talks about, when she really feels that she should have been looking after her children, she did degree after degree to prove that she was not educationally subnormal, and the impact that it had. And that's only something that's possible once somebody's able to make a film about it, and once it becomes clear and accessible to more people. But it's also a story that people would not listen to, that certain people would not listen to, while the Black Caribbean population, with some others, campaigned about a great deal in the 60s and 70s. You'll find a lot written about it from Black people's perspectives. But last year, the Division of Educational and Child Psychology apologized. Just as last year, the American Psychological Association apologized for the racism in the discipline as well, which does not mean the end of a story, but actually shows that these things all need to be understood as historicized, as sort of particular points in time. Okay, I'm going to stop there and stop sharing, really, so that you can, I mean, who knows, in 10 minutes, you can barely say a great deal, but I'd be interested in hearing any comments, any questions. I think questions might well need to be picked up in detail tomorrow, but any comments would be really welcome. And I'm sorry that it was such a whistle-stop tour. I did say a little while ago that I go wild wanting to have a lot of things that I want to say.
Just to say, and you need to not apologize, and you've given us great food for thought. And actually, I believe,